So the entire Masonite application is actually bootstrapped via service providers, and it's actually contained via what's called a service container. If you want to exploit Masonite to the best of its ability, you'll need to know both. Let's go ahead and talk about the service container. So if we go ahead on the left-hand side, we'll see a wsgi.py file. Let's go ahead and open that, and you'll see that we are instantiating a container and performing some important bindings. A lot of this inline documentation is great and informative. So you see we instantiated the container here, and we binded things into the container. Now think of the container as just a dictionary that we're loading and binding things into the container. Then later throughout the application, before our application is finished executing, we could actually retrieve that information, manipulate it, and push it back into the container. This is really powerful because it allows you to add things like other service providers, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which can add functionality to the framework and can either completely change the framework or add functionality to the framework. So you see here that we're actually binding an application key, and the value of that key is the application configuration file up here from config import application. Then down here, we have a container.make. So container.bind and container.make are going to be your two main methods. The container.make essentially just gets the key that we specified above from the container. So you see here that we have a providers constant in our configuration file. If we go ahead and open that up, see that it's right here. So you'll see that we actually are looping through this list and executing the register method on all of them. And we'll go ahead and talk about service providers in a little bit, but keep that in mind. Once we executed all the register methods, which all it does is register things into the container, we can go ahead and actually execute the boot method, which is where all the magic happens in a service provider. This is where you do things like retrieve things from the container, manipulate it, and put it back. This is a really, really great architecture for extending the framework. Now that we see we have a boot and a register method, now notice here that our container actually has a third method called resolve. What this does is it actually resolves the class, method, or function or object that we specify here, in this case, the boot method, and we'll actually resolve it from the container. When we say resolve, we mean grab the parameters that it has and actually inject them from the container. So if we actually open up our config file again, we see we have a Masonite app provider. Let's go ahead and go to GitHub and take a look at that. So you see here, we have the app provider class, and whenever it fires the register, we're actually binding things into the container. On our boot, we're actually also binding a request and a route. Now notice here that we have an environ. The environ is actually set on our start.py down here. So here we binded it, the environ, which is created by our wsgi server, and then we start executing all the boot methods where wsgi is true. So whenever a service provider has a wsgi is true, that means that it requires the wsgi server to be running. So you see here it doesn't have anything. That's because it's inheriting from service provider, which sets it to true by default. So now you'll see that we have a environ here again. So it's resolved actually by the container. So whenever the container resolves this boot method, it'll check itself for an environ, and if it has it, it'll actually inject it into the parameter. Now there's a couple of things that are resolved by the container out of the box, and one of them is controllers. So you see that the request is binded into the container, and our controllers are actually resolved by the container. So let's take a look at that. Let's go ahead and go to our welcome controller. We get our application and our request. There's two ways to grab things from the container. One is by simply specifying it, and another one is the annotation method. So now, for example, what if this controller needed a environ? Instead of somehow trying to import it, you can just specify it. And that's it. Now, whenever this method executes, it'll actually retrieve the environ. And to prove that, let's go ahead and just print the environ. So let's craft serve it. Let's open that up. And if you go back, you see that it actually printed the environ. So what happened is, whenever Masonite executed this method, it looked for all of these and injected them in. So if we tried to execute the application and did the same thing, refresh, come back, and the module application was retrieved from the container. This is really, really powerful stuff because anything you bind into the container is now resolvable through your controllers. So before we end the tutorial, let's just take a look at two providers that come with Masonite. Let's look at a really simple controller, the user provider controller. So you see that we set WSGI to false because we don't actually need the WSGI server to be running. All we're doing is binding things into the container. So now we have this user class. So whenever you need something, all you have to do is specify in your parameters and you got it. It's really, really powerful and you're going to use it all the time. Masonite has really extensive documentation with this stuff. So if you have the time, go ahead, read through the documentation and it'll answer all your questions. Thanks, and I'll see you next tutorial.